what exactly is dangerous about people? I mean, we're so frail, you know. Our little bones and hinges, skeletal muscles. We really don't pose much of a threat to any animals in the animal kingdom unless we have a weapon and an idea. And those ideas, so the most dangerous thing about people is the fact that they're not dangerous. And this breeds such insecurity that if you catch them in the right season, so to speak, ideas can be implanted and implemented to birth at a certain time in the zodiacal great cycle of the eons of the aeons. And when Marina Abramovich, a high-level priestess, it is said, calls on and names Donald J. Trump as a high-level, the highest level magician, you've got to take a second look. There's a language that people are missing. There's a communication that they're missing. And yet everyone is trying to go about doing it in a very ineffectual way. What appears to be on the surface, the way things work, has never been the way they work. But it has. Like, there's always an antithetical notion, or really the movement and the flipping of a duality, and obviously a liminal center point that is much more active and alive than most people would think, or most would care to consider. Those that want to hide their head and pretend that it couldn't be this way. So you can either rest on this sort of false assurance that, which is true, life is boring. Not much happens from a secular sense. And even more so, ironically, the only thing that makes life entertaining is these mathematicians are really the people who could create or generate not just a toy, but an automaton that was capable of movement, and eventually bring about such utility that something like a cooking assist that ended up becoming a microwave, right? A timed exact temperature gauge that we could look at an ingredient panel and generate an exact list that slightly required variant, right? Depending on the altitude and the position and where somebody was preparing that concoction from. We get bored really quick. We get bored in the fact that when we look at these grimoire from archaic grimoire from recent but ancient past, a different world, a different time, that it mostly talks about preparations and herbs and cooking, right? And we fail to see the intention in the words that are spoken and what is being ushered and called an idea, and how powerful an idea can become, especially when through the procession of time others have been summoned by in this hegemony of power, an axis of power, called upon certain names, and that information would be directly fed into and to and through them as a medium. Donald Trump wants to be formidable. He wants to insist that he is formidable. He wants to be a god, and he's going through the process and the action of becoming one, he thinks. And the problem is that deception only works for so long if you are able to get away with that at all. And the reason that transparency and these strange codified messages that we get from these occult practitioners, and trust me, they're all, well, don't trust me, look at the proof. Look at the rituals that are being done out in front of you. People are beginning to, well, not beginning to, they always have, but they're beginning to break down in their reliance that they can't get behind a certain political cause, i.e. the far right, right? Or believe in a democracy when the far right fails them. Or that the church and the belief system that they so shakily go into and provisionally entrust is in fact something that was planned to let them down, and let them down hard it does. It's meant to deceive. Right? Most people garner and gain the idea of power by destroying their own families, thereby ruining themselves, right? They destroy the structural integrity of the idea of what their family is. They wouldn't be able to describe it, and when they do, they realize, or it is revealed, because many don't ever realize at all, that what they're describing isn't a self-supporting unit that can provide for itself. It always requires, in totality, an existential assistance. So if you were to call upon a certain familiar line that required parasitically other familiar lines and other axis of power to provisionally supply everything from food to resources, from clothing to, things that you inherently, innately do not understand and do not know how to provide for yourself. This is really what's missing. Like, it seems like something that's just a superfluous added notion, but in fact, this is the type of stuff that people need to be working on. So many people say, I'm going to bypass this, and they go into this Crowley, OTO type magical ceremonies. I got one good thing that I walked away from, because sometimes I think I'm listening to the voice of reason, and then I realize, no, this person is just playing the same old game where there's an exclusionary measure where once you start listening to most any person who's trying to speak some semblance of truth, you find that they gain support, subscribers, likes, comments by ascribing what they don't believe in, right? To antithetically juxtapose themselves against another familiar pairing, right, of belief systems and ideologies. But they can't really explain what it is that they do. And when they do, it's mercurial and abstract. But there's something very nebulous to it. But I did last night, in fact, hear somebody talk about the Moonchild and what that represents and why that's significant. Because when you get into this occultation of what the whole Babylon working, Jack Parsons, L. Ron Hubbard, Aleister Crowley, and that crew, when you begin to put all this together, you realize why these players were publicized, set into play, but why the manifestation of this Moonchild, or this child of Cancer, right, was so highly important to bring about. One could look at Anton LaVey's daughter and realize, no, that's where most occultists go, is they hide behind Buddhism. This is a person who is a practicing witch, a practicing Satanist, right here. Like, you can feel the energy, you can see it, right? As long as they get opulence and have the ideation that they are better, and that their luxury is provisionally the universe has to provide to them because what? Because they feel so beautiful. They're not. That's a human quality, if you will, deficit. They feel unique. They feel special. But the truth is that they are argumentative, and they are insistent on an idea of themselves that, from this occultation, whether or not it exists or not, as long as they're willing to defiantly, insubordinately rail against the machine and continue to yell and yell and yell until they get their way, this is the magic. Like when you talk about practical magic, this is the magic that they're doing. Is that something takes notice when your rebellion and your short-sighted belief becomes so dysregulated that this entity is extremely aware of you and the fact that you do not function on a primary scale of order, balance, truth, and therefore there's no way that you're easily deceived. You can be played like a card anywhere at any time. And that's the primary power, if you want to get down into it and call it that this black magic and these practitioners go about aiming to achieve, is that they are concrete infants, and they remain the infant forever. They never mature. That doesn't mean that they can't come up with highbrow ideas. They remember things that provisionally offer them nurturing aspects to the, it's not the soul, it's the continuation of the self. What they're deathly afraid of, again, human beings aren't dangerous. The most dangerous thing about human beings is the fact that they're not dangerous, right? And therefore, they're going to want to become dangerous. We're not taught that big, flashy white teeth and long nails are actually a sign of seductive persuasion into, I'm going to carry this weapon along with me. The teeth to bite and gnash at you. Like, you don't know if those things are made out of metal or what, or reinforced with metal. And you're looking at these 6-inch long nails or these pumps, right? You don't know the quadricep power behind it, and that's the whole point, is that there's this espionage of get behind enemy lines, the Manchurian candidate, right? The agent provocateur, the double agent, the secret agent, the 007. It all comes back to the same thing, and it comes back to the occult every single time. And so this Moonchild is a child that's had and born into a world of reality as a ritual from the beginning and throughout the lifetime is a ritual in fact, because there's then set off, you could say a cascade, but it's really this interconnected zodiacal information strand. These occultists really, they look at nature and the ontology and they think the ontology works really slow. Like when you look at the expanse of the universe, and you think of the fact that if something that big has a sensory system, it's going to realize it in a much different space-time sequencing. We're talking about aeons, we're talking about years as opposed to seconds, milliseconds, nanoseconds, getting down into ever smaller units of measure where these rate coding signals seem to have a uniform order relative to the total size or the enthalpy of the entity, right? So when you're getting into something that's so supermassive that it's supposedly still growing, right? And then you have these individualized Boltzmann type brains that seem to operate on a localized scale. Now, what happens when those brains are dysfunct and they no longer congruently work for the better good, for the greater good of the totality? That in fact they have become rebellious and they wish, they determine themselves and their familiar pairings to tear the house down, to burn the house down. So that's essentially what's happening. But it's a very slow process. Chaos, and this chaos magic, if you will, not to try to bootstrap onto any other sort of, not that that's what bootstrapping is, but from the mimicking or mimetic aspect of it, it is. It's to get this system independently running that's really cleaving and stealing, shaving off the main proponents or the main mimetic sequencing that will allow instant information coding to take place. And that's really what's happening, is that there's this idea that when you look at 𝐂𝐴 Greenberg, right? Jacob Greenberg, this Mexican scientist who wrote so many books and believed in this synergic theory of a universal model. Really, he was following that same exact discourse. Leads into Bohm and Burkhard Heim and many other scientists and philosophers that really, in this modern day, in this modern era, lead over to Hameroff and Penrose and other people that are talking about where consciousness lies, right? So again, you can study the sequence, or you can look at the arcane aspects of where the sequence of mimetics, like the first 181 amino acids, to fool your HPTA into thinking that it's already producing growth hormone when it's not. But that fact doesn't matter. When you begin to look at the order, when you get down into the systemization, which is why I really think Nietzsche hated systemization, systems, because I think he fully realized that he was talking about a system himself, and that when you get into systems thinking, at the base root of these systems, you think 1 and 3 are only separated by a 2, but in the expanse of exponentials and so forth, you begin to see that it was a huge canyon, a chasm set apart, and that to look at an integer and to break things down into their constituents, that first number is the most important, where you take that first step from. And so that's why phi or phi, Fibonacci golden mean, is so self-correcting, is because it looks at the monad, and it says, if you're going to count through the Fibonacci sequence, a 0 is a 1, then you've already stated fully that the 0 is in fact not a 0, but a monad, and is a 1. And if it is a 1, then there's no reason to count beyond that. And this seems like a superfluous measure, but this is in fact what all occult ritualization is based on, is the fact that you're always looking at a false number subset at that point, right? You're looking at mucking things up and then looking at the time in event to where there's this elastic and plastic aspect to the ontology where it will it sounds like I'm going off on a tangent, but if you look this up, it's called the vampire steroid for good reason, and it's trembolone. Did you know that trembolone, and at night, it will break down by day, and it will repair at night, to the point where it will fully repair itself. So we're talking about trembolone. It's spilled out into nature. It's supposed to be breaking down, right, and recycling, as things supposedly do. But when you have a specific purpose, is what this states, in my opinion, you're looking at something that can recombinate, and you have to ask yourself how many other things in so-called ontology or nature, and like I say, there's something very unnatural about nature, right? So when you get into this type of codified system, you have to look further, you have to look deeper and go, what is it universally about this number sequence or this number subset that implies to the ontology that this is, because if you have something that's regenerating, self-fixing, and it is really just, really, it's not only carbon, I mean, there's a lot going on there, but you have, in essence, a carbon-based structure, a geometry. That geometry itself is self-generating and self-fixing. And when you find something like that, you have to look at the true properties of what is causing the ontology to go into this elastic and plastic mode as to allow it to repair itself. So then you start to look at us and the complexity and about how trembolone really just merely signifies an aspect of this forward linear thinking model of testosterone, the male component, and the regeneration therein.